or 6 years, suddenly there was this breakthrough known as deep learning. And deep learning did explode into a plethora of new applications and explode into a deep concern around how are we going to manage artificial intelligence? How are we going to ensure that its use is... Now, before we had this breakthrough in AI, in the ethics of emerging technologies, largely a small community of scholars and a few lawyers and policy planners would focus on specific issues. There were long-standing technological unemployment, going back since the dawn of technology. Every technology has created the fear that it will destroy more jobs than it creates. And there's no technology to date that we really know it has done that. Time lag. But artificial intelligence may actually be very different in that regard, because whereby previous technologies replace labor, artificial intelligence is slowly replacing various forms of mental labor. Whether it can reproduce all of our abilities, well, that's a big debate out there, but certainly it's displaying skills that in many cases humans do not have. We cannot parse through massive amounts of data in short periods of time. I mean, it was not learning in the sense that any of us learn. It's not a broad technology, but it was a very specific technology, but it did indicate values in the application of artificial intelligence, and therefore beyond addressing simple, singular technological unemployment or lethal autonomous weapons, and now begin to address the field as a whole. And indirecting that, addressing as a whole, what we saw was this list of ethical principles. By some standards, there are 80 of them. By other standards, there are more than 200 of them. In general, pretty similar. They were all stimulated by a same innate drive, which is that some of these principles are AI specific, but the principles also became broadly about protecting human rights and other values that humanity as a whole wanted to perpetuate into this information age, into this new age that is being developed. And as I said, the principles are actually the same in nearly every respect. We even have the Beijing principles that in all but one respect are the same as pretty much the OECD and the UNESCO principles, which are the most widely endorsed. And the main difference in Beijing principles is it substituted harmony for human rights. Long discussion that I won't go into at the moment as to why that happened in what context of China, but that hasn't slowed down China at all in the regulation. So where do we go from the principles? From the principles, we have countless stages in different organizations, how you might put these principles into practice, how you might operationalize them. And in that process, we become aware of, again, this array of ethical challenges that impinge broadly on the technologies we're going to deploy. So if you read any of these documents, I'm in the midst of the World Health Organization's documents on AI. It's brilliant, it's comprehensive, it's daunting in how many challenges arise and the array of considerations. And they're still only talking about them broadly. So we are just beginning to look at what needs to happen to operationalize the ethical concerns that have arisen. And we have done little as far as putting in place law to protect or ensure our safety, governmental oversight to those who have power in the realm of AI don't dictate what our collective future will be, or utilize that power in a way that may serve their bottom line, but may not serve humanity. And we have very limited governmental structures to not only put in place law, but to ensure that any law that is placed is enforced. Now, to be sure, in some areas where we need new law. We have many areas, for example, is existing liability law, but that doesn't mean it's being enforced in the context of AI. And AI has certain peculiarities which are allowing those who might be culpable to avoid responsibility for what AI systems do. So that's where we are now. We're in the transition from thinking through broad principles and considering consider how we might operationalize those principles to actually in place incentives and disincentives to ensure that we create a future worth bequeathing to our children. We want to live in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. So now I'll go to the table. If you can sit. So. Bruce, Nico.
Oh, sure.
So, I left one person out of the introduction, and that person is Curtis. He's the director. Sorry, it's associate of AI governance and the future society, and I intentionally left him as the last one because I wanted the group to give him a round of applause because he's incredible support. So Samuel has been the one editing and he's been interacting with 18 strong-headed persons, and he's been incredibly good at negotiating both convey and to try to put it on paper. So I think that really owns a really debt of gratitude to Sam, incredibly helpful. Now Sam and Kathy will please join us on stage. So they will offer us an overview, 10 recommendations that the group. Please.
All right, everyone. So I'm going to be reading our recommendations. I think I ought not to go off script because we labored over these words quite a bit. And as Francesco mentioned, we had a number of very, very experienced, educated, and opinionated people in this group. So I don't want to mince words here, and I think many of you have the recommendations in front of you, so you're welcome to read along. I'm mostly going to be reading these words, maybe adding a little bit of my own flair. And I guess I should also note, so I'm going to be reading the first 5 recommendations. My colleague Dr. Katie Evans is going to be reading the last 5. A slight difference in the order of these. We were working until the early hours this morning, but these changes are only stylistic, substantive. So our first recommendation was for governments on both sides of the Atlantic to implement international agreements on AI and to translate them into national standards. By now, a number of international agreements have established global norms for the governance of AI, and this includes the OECD AI Principles, the UNESCO Recommendations on the Ethics of AI, and the Council of Europe's proposal for an international AI convention. We recognize that these must now be implemented, transposed into national law, by governments. These global norms are the basis of policies, the implementation of standards, and the allocation of resources to support the enforcement of such laws and standards. And to give, global norms for AI must also be transposed into trade agreements and standards. And critically, we acknowledge that there is a level of international and institutional commitment that does not yet exist. Our second recommendation is for the establishment of new law mechanisms for AI. Last week, you might have seen that in the US, we witnessed the publication of a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And now, there is an opportunity in the United States to implement guidelines and recommendations. To this end, the U.S. Congress should pass legislation to address the key challenges of the rights afforded in this blueprint, which are safe and effective, algorithmic fairness and equity, data privacy, algorithmic transparency and explainability, and accountability. U.S. Congress should furthermore enact the algorithmic accountability. This was a bill introduced in both chambers earlier this year, while states in their own right should continue to develop innovative legislative responses to the challenges AI presents. And on the other side of the Atlantic, in the Union, we must reckon with the fact that the nature of the AI industry is cross-sectoral and transnational, and we need to develop a legal basis for regulators to similarly collaborate cross-sectorally and across borders. Regulators will only be able to investigate business conduct and demand requisite information, but must also be able to share their findings with other regulators. The framework for coordinated information sharing between the EU and member state regulators covers all sectors relevant to AI and the platform economy would enable this. And finally, within both the EU and the US, the decision of all regulatory actions should be made available to the public via a central access point. Our third recommendation is to establish and enforce clear deployments of AI systems that violate fundamental human rights. The UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics calls for prohibitions on social scoring, use of AI techniques for mass surveillance. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has urged a moratorium on AI techniques that fail to safeguard fundamental human rights. We recommend that AI policymakers carry forward these recommendations, among others, in the development of enforcement procedures. The EU Court of Justice has indicated that machine learning techniques may be incompatible with the protection of fundamental rights, and as a consequence, these may be required to redesign automated systems to safeguard fundamental rights. Our fourth recommendation is to support coordinated efforts for technical standards, benchmarking, and certifications of compliance. Standards, benchmarks are powerful instruments of soft law that can incentivize developers to create AI systems that are more robust, interpretable, and trustworthy, provided that they comply with the applicable legal requirements and further the goal of compliance with those requirements. Executive agencies must therefore allocate funding towards the creation of publicly available datasets and public evaluation infrastructure to measure the performance of AI systems and determine the risks that they may pose. Executive agencies should develop standards for curating datasets and protocols that are interoperable. Furthermore, executive agencies should require human rights experts and civil society organizations in such efforts. The U.S. Trade and Technology Council should continue to seek alignment with organizations such as CENELEC, IEEE, ISO, and others to develop standards and evaluative tools. And our fifth recommendation is to build capacities across to effectively enforce laws. An effective enforcement regime the capacities of our existing institutions. Such enhancements will include strategic shifts in priorities, the clarification of responsibilities across agencies, the hiring of additional clerks and technical experts, and investments in upskilling and AI literacy. In some other cases, entirely new regulatory approaches should be established. Such approaches will include new oversight capacities, such as public audit capabilities designed to ensure operational accountability, new disclosure regimes, requirements for publication of information about data sources and algorithmic techniques, and new remedies, such as the disgorgement of data wrongfully obtained. Enforcement agencies should develop mechanisms to share tools and resources across borders and sectors. They should also work to jointly develop the necessary enforcement techniques in partnerships with independent tech communities, academia, and civil society. And now I'll pass it to Dr. Katie Evans, who will read the final 5 recommendations.
And let's see if I can live up to your very high elocutionary standards. Our 6th recommendation was to ensure that public interest supersedes countervailing assertions of intellectual property. IP concerns cannot be a shield against legitimate public. Overly broad indications of trade secrets ought to be resisted. When enforcement activity encounters genuine trade secrets, so information not generally known to the public, regulators can safeguard legally recognized commercial interests without jeopardizing enforcement in the public interest. For example, by designating a public interest steward who is granted access to proprietary information. Infrastructures for cross-sectoral and cross-regulation need to be designed in line with these principles. The 7th recommendation is to launch a transatlantic observatory for reporting AI and to help hold developers and deployers of AI systems accountable. Observatory, executive agencies should should establish portals enabling citizens to report suspected violations of international and national law, including safety incidents and human rights violations. Such initiatives such as the AI Incident Database. It would help to ensure that developers and deployers of AI systems are held accountable for their actions throughout the lifecycle of an AI system. Furthermore, it would enable researchers, policymakers, and civil society organizations to monitor the compliance of AI systems with existing legal frameworks. Lastly, such an observatory would help defend citizens who nowadays lack authoritative mechanisms of support and can hence easily fall victim to security or human rights violations by AI systems. The institutional of such an observatory will encourage corporations to act in accordance with regulatory frameworks and to adopt transparent mechanisms to communicate actions and decision-making process to the public, for example, by providing documentation and conducting external audits. So, recommendation is to empower academia and the public to participate meaningfully in oversight and enforcement. Executive agencies must recognize that it is within their democratic duty to ensure that academia and civil society actors are engaged and are able to hold executive agencies accountable. This involves ongoing consultation with these actors as enforcement mechanisms are operationalized, and providing access to information necessary for such actors to meaningfully issues. For example, as described in the UNESCO recommendation AI Ethics, the AI Guidelines of the European Law Institute, and the draft EU AI Act, impact assessment should be publicly accessible and framework should support public research, audit, and benchmarking capabilities. Executive agencies should also create processes for inclusive publication in the oversight of AI implementations, beyond simply reporting an opportunity for public comment and review of proposed remedies. Additionally, they should recognize and afford effective protection for a public right to particular implementations of AI systems. Our next recommendation is to invest in the development of trustworthy AI tools to enforcement of regulatory law. To address the mounting needs of legal enforcement, public investment is needed to support the development of trustworthy AI systems that serve the public interest of enforcing the law. In competition law, tax law, labor law, consumer protection law, data privacy law, and laws related to the integrity of elections and resource. The executive administration should consider the adoption of AI designed to hold corporations accountable for sustainability reporting, citizens seeking due process, identify tax violations, and make control more responsive and transparent to inquiries made by their representatives. It is vitally important that these AI meet the highest standards for fairness, accountability, and transparency, and comply with all legal obligations. If AI systems do not reach such standards, they should not be deployed. Executive adopt procurement policies that require providers of these AI systems to adhere to such standards, and executive agencies should participate in the development of standards so that they are aligned with the conditions and requirements of executive function. And finally, our 10th recommendation was to sanction corporations that violate laws or use AI to undo the law. Enforcement measures should ensure meaningful change in business practices, extending throughout the AI lifecycle and deter violations. Such sanctions may include the erasure of data sets or treatment of AI systems entirely, the payment of fines, compensation to transparency reporting, the split up of a company, or the takedown of a domain. Multiple remedies often will be necessary. Dissuasive monetary sanctions combined with directives to alter. Criminal sanctions on executives are appropriate when AI is developed or deployed with the clear intent to deceive or harm individuals, or to break the law, or the reckless indifference to the likelihood of effects. Thank you.
Maybe could I add one comment that I meant to mention as I was introducing, just to acknowledge that reading text might not be the most part of an event, but as Paul was mentioning at this event, these words, I think we all believe, have a lot of value in them. really the product of a consensus. Head into some of the responses in the Q&A. I invite you all, and after this event, to engage with this. If you think that there's something wrong, or that we missed something, please let us know. We would really appreciate that.
Thank you. So now we will basically follow with some comments that I will unfold a little bit the 10 recommendations that we are going through. And I agree with Sam. Basically, we see the beginning of a moment of understanding. The recommendations are quite complex and they are really trying to achieve something. Part of the process, is that if you have time to read it, you are, of course, going to become signatories of the document. A fundamental part of this document is building consensus around the recommendations. So we see this as the first opportunity for some people to recommendation and subscribe to the intentions of this. The process is intentionally designed to evolve. That's why there's been a presentation in Rome, and then there's going to be the presentation in Brussels. There will be for see what the impact of these ideas are. I want to give the floor to other members of the group that will share in your views of some of the key sections of the So perhaps we can start with Nicholas and please tell us what you think.
Thank you for hosting us so nicely, so productively here in the transatlantic profession. We're going to be very short. I'm the founder and president of Society, one of the supporting entities of this whole endeavor. And as such, I've been one of the leading forces behind this attention paper on AI in the world. We're a non-profit and we present ourselves, and I think that we are deep into the fact of being a global civil society actor. As a civil society actor, we are particularly aware and preoccupied with of whether or not and how civil society and academia is and can be involved in the downstream enforcement of any form of legal application. We have seen in the past how when a vibrant civil society is organized in Europe, civil society, through the mechanisms of enforcement, hold businesses and governments to account. And having civil society participating, as we have exemplified, like academia, in the enforcement as a downstream actor to hold accountability to a real high standard is a key element, and is a key element of ensuring the law as the bedrock of democracy. And that's something that, judges, police officers, law policymakers, and administrators, it's also citizens, if you allow the expression, as little foot soldier of the enforcement. But if we don't create the mechanisms for that to be practically realized by, for example, providing access to this impact assessment, providing access to a lot of data, this cannot be rendered. Well, I'll stop there just to give you a bit of a spicing up and Dr. K was saying. Thank you. Bruce, you want to add anything more?
Sure. Well, I'd like to draw thank you for that. What I'd like to draw the audience's attention to is recommendation 4, if I could. Thank you. Recommendation 4, the one headed efforts for technical standards benchmarking and certifications of compliance. This one is dear to my heart because of its practical focus, and more specifically because of its focus on creating the practical means by which we can assess a subject or a system with the law. If we think about assessing compliance, we can see that there are at least 2 essential elements: criteria and evidence. Criteria that define in a well-articulated way whether you're compliant or not compliant with the law, and evidence, the question of whether a subject or system is in fact meeting those criteria. And the need for criteria is met by certification standards. The need for evidence is met by benchmarks. And both of these are response to the recommendation for benchmarks might be, hold on, don't we already have benchmarks? Aren't there enough evaluations out there of the effectiveness? And the answer is, while there are evaluations out there, academic and otherwise, there's an ongoing program of benchmarks designed to serve the interests of the law. What is needed of a program that would serve the interests of the law is a number of things. It must have a number of specific attributes. First of all, be ongoing, not just one-off. It has to keep up with change technology and advances in technology, so it has to be ongoing, ideally in some way. It must measure system effectiveness against a broad measure, not some defined measure of performance, such as accuracy, overall fitness of purpose in a real-world setting that may include taking into account ethical questions such as bias and so on. But they need to be part of how we measure a system's fitness for purpose. And it should also, or just say that, it should be rural and comprehensive, and there currently is a program that fits that bill. And so what we are advocating for is a program that will serve the purpose, because in the absence of such a program, assessing compliance with the law and therefore enforcing the law meets significant obstacles. Recognizing that implementing such a program is no light task. There are many challenges to it, including reaching consensus on on metrics for hard-to-define concepts, such as fairness, bias, and so on. And practical challenges, such as finding data sets that are for generating meaningful metrics. And there are other challenges as well. Now, fortunately, we are already at square one. A number of organizations have done already, IEEE, Sensenelec, ISO, and others. But there's still more work to be done. Hence, this recommendation's call for action for executive agencies, not just support, but collaborate in the development of a benchmark program that will meet the needs of the law and advance enforcement of the law.
So, building up on what Bruce touched up on recommendation number 4, I would like to address the role of technical standards in standards production or enforcement of rules regarding AI and of IEEE in particular. So, for those of you who might not be too clear on what standards actually do, they operate as a technical lingua franca, so to speak. Actually, they are protocols which are widely understood, they are consistent, and universally adopted. So, one of the panacea standards can be a solution to the so-called pacing problem. Namely, soft law can produce a law which has hard consequences. So, while the wheels of legislative process are often slow to turn, that is not the case for soft law. It can operate as a credible indirect enforcement mechanism, not only flexible, but also adaptable, and standards can do both. In the absence of concrete regulation, they can morph into enjoy the perception of legitimacy, and then constantly bosses of law. So legislative and regulatory bodies also, to be sure, tend to neutral technical organizations in order to acquire a better understanding of technical impact. And this comes with two benefits. First, they can draw from their factual and technical expertise, which is grounded in reality by proposing technically sound, feasible, and viable solutions. We are thus enabled to herald a new collaboration between political actors, between regulators, and technical community, thus placing humanity in the epicenter of technological innovation in itself will be the endgame. A sounding paradigm collaboration of IEEE with UK legislators and regulators, development of the 8th Appropriate Design Code. This code translates that digital technologies interact and engage with children, and in the UK last year, while just a few weeks ago, directly inspired by the Age Appropriate Design Code, was unanimous in California. Finally, IEEE certified initiative, for example, where principle can turn into practical action. Some develops ethical standards which assess the trustworthiness of AI systems by relying on the pillars of transparency, accountability, privacy, and bias. Thus, businesses bearing certified mark commitment and conduct to their users will also demonstrate that they are willing to align with imminent future national and international ethical standards to be adopted. So I guess if I can leave you with one thing, it is the hope that technological innovation and technological organizations will not merely put technological advancement for its own sake, but instead they might focus on a much bigger ambition. The collaboration with other actors, not only regulators and legislators, in order to usher in a new era of enlightenment of the digital transformation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now we'll move to that are connected remotely, and so I'll give the floor to Mark.
Thank you very much, Francesco. On behalf of the Center for AI and Digital Policy, it's a real pleasure to join you today. And I want to thank my colleagues for all of their good work on this manifesto. I'll say just a few words about the timing of the issuance of this declaration. I think it is a particularly opportune moment to release the state in two respects. First of all, as Paul outlined, we are facing a crisis of democracy and questions of law. And I believe the declaration speaks to the importance of effective and legitimate legal enforcement of law. And in that respect, the timing of the declaration. But there's another dimension as well that we should consider, and that concerns the AI policy. Because just in the last few maturing of AI policy, as we question of ethics to the establishment of law. Beginning with the OECD AI principles in 2019, endorsed by the G20 in the same year, onto the approach at UNESCO and the recommendation on AI ethics in 2021, and now with the discussions underway at the European Union and the Canada and national governments around the world, we are seeing response within the context of democratic institutions carry forward effective and meaningful regulation of this new technology. And I actually see this as a very hopeful moment where we can point to these new norms and realized in practice. And the manifesto in this context serves a particularly important role because it speaks not only to this moment, but it also speaks to the critical transatlantic relationship and the need for leading democracies to coordinate their AIs. The next meeting of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council will be later this month. This manifesto is an input to that policy process as it is to many others. So this is an important contribution, a timely contribution. And again, I wanted to thank my colleagues for the opportunity to work with you on this document. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas, please, you're next.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I'm Thomas Strines. I'm the Executive Director of Rorini Global Law and Tech at NYU. I'm speaking to you from New York. Maybe in my talk show on 8th grade mastermind of European integration and Mohamed Ali, great with the fighting spirit. And in some ways, our group was about bringing together these different sensibilities, different ideas from a range of disciplines. And that work I've transformed from a European with a German, someone who works on global governance issues and embraces different social theory approaches towards law and digital technologies. One is this great challenge to embrace the complexity of the world, the complexity of distributed AI production, distributed infrastructures, easily escape the conventional categories to which we have regulated technologies, and that also easily transcend the jurisdictional by which we have organized our nation states and our democracies. It's recognize the complexity, but it's also important to then focus on things that are manageable. And it's important to find language that people, the lawmakers understand, the policymakers understand. So no, not just public discourse if I describe artificial intelligence as a socio-technical human and non-human actor. Those who are steeped in the work of Lady Bruno Latour will understand that kind of approach to science and technology in society. But it's important to find language that everyone understands, makers understand. And I think our recommendations try to be theoretically informed, but then find language that is clear in its recognition. And just highlighting two aspects in this regard. One is the challenge of papers, where it's important to recognize that you can regulate. It's not impossible to regulate. It is not always the thing. It is not too complex. You can steer AI development in directions that are governed, that are accountable to public interest, and that are public oversight by civil society, as others have emphasized. And Bruce said standards are really important in that regard. So to the state for law, they need to pass a law and that compliance will follow. I think that's a strong sense that goes on the sanctions side, be credible when it comes to following with legal requirements, but also when it comes to implementation, to pay attention to what kind of standards are being developed. Because in the past we have seen instances where standards have been arguably not in line with the law. So if you look at the AIB standards for the transparent consent framework, there's no litigation about that kind of standard. And whether they forward the goals that the general data protection regulation had. So to avoid that kind of scenario, we need a different kind of standard set. There's more public interest oriented and more accountable to the democracies that are ultimately made to govern and self-govern the development of artificial intelligence. So that's, I think, one message that the manifesto sends, and I had the chance to again participate in this exercise and to learn some more. You only regret that I can't be in the eternal city to celebrate with you tonight.
All right. Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, so to open the conversation, basically we ask of respondents to engage with the manifesto. So the first one that I'd like to invite to comment on. Sorry, just 1 second. They're trying to fix the sound. 1 second. Can you say a few words, please? Can you just talk?
Yes, of course.
Oh, okay. Now we're trying. Okay. The first one that I'd like to comment on the matter is Dr. Anna Malewski, and she's the president of Confindus there in Udine. So thank you for participating, and we are eager to kind of know what view of the manifesto is from the industry.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Good evening, everyone. Enforcing law in the age of artificial intelligence was submitted to the attention of the industrial production for a review and comment, and I thank all the organizers for involving us in this opportunity to us. As Francesco said, I'm Vice President at the office and a member of the executive board of Danieli Group, working inside the steel industry. So going directly, this document deals with a very complex issue and perspective on some basic assumptions on which we can only agree. First one, we all agree that the application of AI involves significance in all fields, that if they ever were to start, will have to be fought and persecuted. Second, we agree that wanting to manipulate the human mind is a very different to make hard, dangerous, and routine industrial processes. The industry needs to to use its own or its customers' data generated by its own or its customers' plan for several, some of which are to improve operating conditions, to optimize processes, to improve the performance and quality of product and services, or to maximize health and the interaction between man and plant, and of course to reduce waste and decrease generation of value to be issued. What we have noticed going through the document is that there is distinctions inside, and this is not an accusation of acknowledgement. AI is not something stable or without development. Law is by definition a product of the society that it regulates. Therefore, the result is consistent with the context in which it is created. And speaking of AI, which in fact is developing a speed we are not used to, we must be careful to promote a full development of its potential, avoiding, on one hand, abuses and uses that infringe people's rights, and promoting, on the other hand, process innovation. But how? Let's talk about solutions, as we are used to do inside the company. First of all, distinguish those who sell or use AI applications, some data typically obtained from large masses of users, on large businesses in general, from those who sell AI techniques, starting from their own processes. So I'm talking about other manufacturing. Second, but not by importance, keeping in mind the competition in the global market that is often unfair and its legislative context. In fact, if the regulations stop the evolution of AI in US and EU, may be overwhelmed by unfair competition from those countries where it is easy to evade the law or where the rules are missed together. Third, but also in this case not for importance, paying much attention to the tendency of people to apply cases instead of detailed judgments. We must therefore pay attention to give rise to widespread prejudices. The right that we would like to pass is that for wealth to be shared, it needs to be created, and this is the role of companies, nothing without their collaborators, whose aim is strengthened thanks to AI processes, and they create added value, the only real driver increasing the quality of life, as the more the required skill and therefore the personal is. And to end, however, since the basic process manufacturing industry will soon have evolved in the massive application of AI, now not so developed, and therefore it will be necessary to participate in the creation of regulations for an effective and risk-free application for the users. Thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Any responses? Well, thank you. I think you're totally right about the kind of necessity of engagement. I hope that we can remain open, and that the response that you just gave can be shared with others on the platform as we read. So the next I'd like to introduce is Valentin, who is a member of the Government of Canada Advisory Council and the United Nations AI Policy and Governance expert. Please, Valentin.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much to all members of the manifesto for the invitation and the opportunity to speak today. I apologize. I usually do an interactive presentation. I will be reading to you today to make sure that I can fit a certain context and a number of questions addressed to you. I am a lawyer. I'm the founder and executive director of AI Impact Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization that strives to facilitate responsible My work focuses on bridging civic knowledge mobilization with policy innovation for responsible AI strategies in digital democracies. Indeed, as a member of the Advisory Council on AI Canada, UN expert and AI policy, I have had the opportunity to contribute to the design and analysis of emerging regulatory frameworks on AI and data, including the anticipatory foresight of their socioeconomic implications. I have read and made the following comments. First of all, congratulations for achieving a work that I'm sure took much effort to achieve. There are a number of elements that are extremely positive. What I would like to focus on, maybe for my question, the context setting questions, is the private sector-led lobbying and industry-led promotion of AI are undermining trust in this new technology and its possibilities, as well as the trust in our government's capacity to lead AI's adoption fairly and without conflicting interests. The lack of trust in democratic institutions is a weakness in sustainable digital economic models and national security strategies. It is the Achilles heel of increasingly complex market interaction, involvement, and trade and cooperation among states and stakeholders of global alliances. And it facilitates polarization and misinformation and its devastating impacts to societies today. Redressing the balance between the civil, the private, and the public sectors by adopting a civil society-centric, a civil sector-centric approach in AI and developing the government is similarly touched upon in the framework, in the manifesto, in its recommendations, mentioning but leaving much of the power still in the hands of industry. Trustworthiness is defined as a technical issue, while there is an opportunity for public comment. This puts civil society organizations in front of a fait accompli instead of true partners of AI enforcement mechanisms. My questions to you there's four questions. How will this manifesto avoid industry design standards and underfunded civil society organizations being charged with their governance, with the role of enforcing industry-led evaluation tools? My second question, recommendation 2 in manifesto, was changed between the draft and final version, and I'm curious to know why. Why did we go from innovative partnership structures with technology developers, academia, and civil society to enforcement agencies that should develop mechanisms to share tools and resources across borders and sectors, and should work jointly to develop the necessary enforcement technology partnerships with independent technical communities, which I'm curious what that is exactly, academia and civil society? How do you envision the civil sector as one of the critical pillars in democratic societies, being part of these mechanisms beyond token consultations? That's my second question. Third question, how will the development of trustworthy AI tools, which is recommendation number 8, I believe, development of trustworthy AI tools to assist in enforcement of regulatory law, how does this not deepen an already gendered and regional gap in AI and its development and weapons? My question number 4, last one, how do you envision the manifesto bringing with the obligations of signatory states of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Thank you very much for taking your answers.
Thank you very much. I don't think we can answer all the 4 questions, but perhaps we should start with the first one first, and Nicholas wants to make a comment.
Thank you, Francesco. It takes a lot, but I think these are great points, great questions. I just try and address a bit of the first one. So, I, for one, fully agree with where you're pushing us, which is that for civil society to be meaningfully involved in the enforcement of these mechanisms, of these regulations, indeed we need to look at concepts such as co-design. It's the case in civil society as much in my view as it's the case in the field of labor rights and trade unions, where you would want workers and those leading and managing environments in their working conditions to be in the same situation. So it's a process here. We need to move towards a bit more of co-design. And you're right, absolutely right to say that for this to happen, let's not kill ourselves. And we need a bit of money on the table for these civil society organizations to be able to discharge their duty loyally and in a way that can protect their integrity, their independence, and that's not easy. That's not easy. Why? Because in a lot of ways, in so many ways, it means for them to be able to master the capacity without relying on the industry. For them to be able to be independent and operate on a level playing field and a position of strength with the industry. That's not always easy. But we have, on both sides of the Atlantic, legal statutes that allows civil society to remain as non-profit and benefit from donations which are tax exempt. These statutes in the US fall under the 501c3 non-profit status. We lack in the European Union a unified status that would allow a continental level civil society organizations to operate seamlessly and to be able to operate as a tax exempt organization across the continent. There are many works around that exist, but still we do not have yet a unified status. And in a way, in response to you, and a call to action to all of you is, these statutes are meant to be used. You don't need to give to the free society, choose, pick, but give. Choose your preferred organization and realize that by doing that, you are supporting vibrant civil society with whatever types of downstream enforcement accountability that is needed for whatever type of application. In this case, we're talking about AI. We could talk about many other domains. These statutes were developed for you as consumers, for you as citizens, for you as taxpayers in those contexts, to be able to act and vote. You can vote with your wallet. Here you can vote with your taxes. These are tools which are defined for citizens to be empowered towards institutional innovations. These civil society actors are considered to be purveyors of institutional innovations next to and on top of bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are not meant to be innovative, but that's fine. Civil society can have a little bit of margin to maneuver and can go across. So that's why I would build upon that very first question that you gave, Resta. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valentin. So we are moving to the next respondent. It's Bree Esselbach, and she's the senior expert of the European Commission International Outreach for a Human-Centric Approach to AI. And relevantly for this conversation, she's also currently supporting the working group 1 of the DDC drafting of the EU-US joint AI roadmap.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this nice introduction, and also just to emphasize that I'm not representing the European Commission. I'm actually working for the European Commission as an independent expert, and was also part of the high-level group on AI. Another relevant thing also in terms of how I'm thinking about reading this manifesto is that I'm also a co-founder of a non-profit data agency where we've been active in this field for the last 8 years. And now, first I want to express my appreciation of this really important document. It really addresses a moment that seems very critical and the urgency of the moment where we feel a little bit that everything is up in the air. Nothing is as certain as we thought it used to be. My first really appreciation is the depth of the description of all the authors that really put so much depth into description of the specific challenges of AI in this field, calling out the current power asymmetries, which of course as an organization, Data Ethics, that was been active in this field and was established for that core purpose. We really appreciate that recommendation, which is the empowering academia and civil society in participating meaningfully in enforcement, which was also mentioned before. I also want to emphasize the support for for international agreements, the recommendation 1, of course, and the creation of standards making and compliance mechanisms, which is mentioned in recommendation 4. Of course, this is pivotal for creating that kind of responsible technology culture that has been really lacking in this field, in the technology field, and which we are starting to create now. And of course, this is also a key focus of the TTC negotiations, and I see really a lot of really meaningful and important ideas in this manifesto that can be brought forward in that work. Now, I wanted to also raise a little bit of a concern. Of course, AI-specific regulations and recommendations, they are very prominent in this moment. They're also very prominent in the manifesto. And this is what we really like to talk about. But one thing I want to raise a little bit of kind of concern here, that I think that the most democratic thing we can do right now with those is not to rush into implementation. We actually have to make certain that we have these legal frameworks, that they're right. Because this is, of course, like democracy in the making. We're slow, but we're thorough, and that's something that, for example, the EU is really good at. So what I'm really concerned about is how behind we are in the enforcement of our existing human rights laws and conventions in this space. Of course, you know, many of us that's been active in this field have been worrying about this for a long time now. The fact that the UN General Assembly could, in 2013, had to actually reaffirm that the offline rights we have also apply online is quite stunning to many of us. This thing that we couldn't take this for granted. So the recommendation 3 of the manifesto I find really, really important. Of course, one thing that I don't see too strong in the manifesto that I think could also be even stronger maybe is the development of a more comprehensive body of human rights case law on AI to set legal precedents. This is really missing. In the early days, we had cases like Resta versus the UK and other really important cases that have shaped the positive obligations of states in the context of new forms of computer automation. And now, more specific to AI, we've had the Dutch Siri case by civil society organizations. We've had the Uber robo-fines case by the Uber driver unions. We've had here in Italy the Italian Garante fining Clearview 20 million euros for GDPR breaches, and we have many others of those now. So I would really like to see an even stronger position of the enforcement of existing human rights standards and laws in conversations like this. Regulation 5 of the manifesto is really important, empowering existing enforcement bodies like the data protection authorities in the EU, and broadening their scope, not weakening them, which I'm seeing in many places at the moment. For example, in Denmark, where I am from, we are actually talking about reducing their national budget. And again, emphasizing this thing that we need to empower civil society actors to fight complaints on human rights violations. And this is where I really want to commend this idea of creating a transatlantic observatory to file complaints, which is something I'll personally seek to bring forward. And this takes me to my last and final point about the very nature of these transatlantic cooperations, and in specific also the TTC, which is this balancing of interests in the development of what we call the risk-based frameworks and the approach to risk. And here I see, and I've seen it for a long time now, a clash of interests, where prioritizing human rights is somewhat automatically considered a risk to markets. And this is a perception that I've seen for many years on both sides, in the EU and the US as well. And this is, of course, why we really need to think about enforcing these existing human rights standards that we've been agreeing on for decades now. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like, let's see if I. Juliana, are you connected?
Yes, I'm connected. Okay, thank you very much.
Can you turn on the video? Let me first.
Yes, I do. My video is on, so let me know if you can see me.
Alright. 1 second, let me spotlight you. Alright, so in Juliana Imam, she's the director of the JIIPCC and the STEM Foundation in Nigeria, and she's been dealing with AI for a number of years. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesco, and thanks to everyone here. I think this is a beautiful document. So I got it last night, and I've actually gone through it. So there are certain things that come to mind after reading it. One is, for the first point that has to do with the implementation of international treaties. First of all, I would like to say that, for example, here in Nigeria, laws, treaties that are signed have to be domesticated. If they are not domesticated, then they are just persuasive in nature. That means it's not binding and it can't really be enforced. So what I would advise is for these treaties that are being given to different nations to look through to sign, it's good that they are actually domesticated, because if they are not domesticated, then they cannot be enforced. So that's first. Secondly, for building the capacities of those in the enforcement units and agencies and all that, I think that's very important. Here in Nigeria and in some parts of Africa, we see that most of these organizations, some still use paper and biro. They are not so conversant with tech and all that. So bringing artificial intelligence into all this is far for like a lot of people. So there would have to be training, there would have to be serious awareness for people to even know how to use these things. Then you also spoke about creating tools that are trustworthy. So I'd like to speak to this from opening it up to different people to actually create these tools. So if it is open to those who, like women, girls, boys, those who are blind, different people with different issues, creating these things, they can factor in what people want to see. But if it's just like a set of people in an office creating these things and people in the minority don't really buy into it, then they might not be able to enforce it. Finally, when you spoke about sanctions, I think sanctions are also good, but I think that it's most important that there's a level of awareness. So when people hear about AI and all those things, they just think that it's a robot, someone that's going to take over the world, take over their jobs, and all that. So if people don't understand what AI is in the first place, they will not be able to embrace it. So I think looking at it from an African perspective, about it first, let the awareness be high, let people understand what AI is and how to embrace this properly, and then the domestication of all this is also very important, because if it is not domesticated, then it cannot be enforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So thank you for pointing out to one element of this document. When we had the discussion, of course, this is a transatlantic effort. So perhaps the focus has been obviously on the relation between the US and Europe. But of course, a fundamental dimension would be to try to see how to extend the conversation with the rest of the world. It's fundamental for democracies to collect themselves and design strategies, but it's equally important that this process doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that includes communication that are trying to reach out. To build up on this topic, I invited Eugenio Garcia, who's the Deputy Consul General at the Consulate of Brazil in San Francisco, and is the head of the Science and Technology and Innovation in the Silicon Valley. He is the so-called tech diplomat of Brazil in the Silicon Valley in the US. He participated remotely because it was overlapping kind of schedule, but he sent us a video that I'm going to play now for you.
Thank you for the invitation to join this discussion, and congratulations on this consensus manifesto. This is an important contribution on AI governance. I'm speaking from San Francisco, which has become a hub for tech diplomacy. The European Union has just opened a new office here. Discussions on tech diplomacy and AI have been taking place mostly in Europe, North America, some Asian countries. The Global South, however, is underrepresented. Many countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, they are absent from this vital conversation. And in my view, for tech diplomacy to be truly global, all interested parties should have their say. I understand your initiative is focused on EU-US relations, but my question to you is, how can we move from a geographically limited scope to a global common approach to AI governance? How can we include more countries and widen this effort you are trying to push forward? So maybe a multilateral setting could help. The United Nations, for instance, can provide an inclusive platform for cooperation with multiple stakeholders. Multilateralists cannot provide all the answers, of course, but it has a long-established architecture for broad representation and can be an alternative. I agree.
Society a bit silotic. While I think, and I suppose the point saying that the recommendation number 6 about research and civil society is extremely important, at the same time, I would say the difference that we have is a completely different approach. Is the approach of the private sector, the public sector, the academia, the civil society, the international organizations that have been probably, I would say, expressed here, from the UN to the UNESCO to the OECD to the European Commission, nominating it. They need to work together to entice the process. And somehow we still treat them silotically because they need, in a way, to. But at the same time, we need to have a common understanding on whether we gather on this or we will fail. The capacity of understanding the complexity of in our society. And I think in this sense, we have other tools that are attached to the ones that are nominated here. Artificial intelligence per se cannot be treated silotically. Artificial intelligence to be only comprehensive in what we do, because it's a tool, but it's not the objective, it's not the goal. So things like the digital compass promoted by the European Commission, but several other, I would say, meaningful ways promoted now by UNESCO can be of help in the issue of enforcing law in artificial intelligence more and more. One of the things that I, again, and this is just a suggestion because it comes from my previous experience.
We have. On design, it really is invest as much or more of our thought into how actually standards, laws, the kind of abstractions we're putting into how to work, how we hope it works, how we hope it will be governed, and look at the implementation of technology and the connection between technologists and policymakers. Manifesto, but I really don't think we spend enough time on that topic. From building web browsers, the chasm between a standard and what actually works and then what actually works across many people implementing the same standard, it's a tremendously difficult thing to work out. It takes much iteration. Just really look at that question as being as critical as a portion of that. Look at that relationship between technologies, technologists, tech companies, and policymakers. And we aim to be one of those companies, one of those technology creators who can work closely with policymakers on these questions of implementation. The second thing I would say is just things like privacy law or even rights-based law. And we built them into our early regulatory frameworks for things like AI. But I think they rarely take into account how massively scaled adaptive systems. Systems that also have kind of built-in things that accrue over time that are hard to change. Jacobs, the urban philosopher who lived much of her life here in Toronto, cities as things that grow over time and interweave. Things are hard to change and are fundamental, but also are changing every day. And the connection between that adaptation and that sort of fixedness is very much the case when we talk about the digital world, or the digital world that we're talking about here today. And so I think we need to look at things like the field and urban planning regulation, in addition to many of the frameworks that we've up to now, in order to look at how we might best live with these systems that will be with us decades, centuries, really years to form. We're talking about human society as we go forward, and we don't have the muscle on how to regulate it, how to enforce it, or how to build it. And that's really
the future society. We kind of reached out to as many people we could in different groups, and there was an overwhelming interest in the amount of people that participated to the response to the recommendations. You've been incredibly patient also, and I hope you'll be incredibly committed in the recommendations and trying to endorse them. And I personally would like to thank Paul Nimitz and Constantina Karakalis for initiating this what feels like forever 2 years. So Nicholas Economou, that is also with the Future Society, that was the first person, Paul and Constantinos, on the project. The Athens Roundtable, the Greek government created a platform to make these voices heard. The Future Society that supported the initiative and was kind enough to welcome very warmly into the project. I feel privileged to be part of this. I believe in what we wrote, and I know it's been a little stretch, but a lot of important things have to be said. Thank you to all of the members. For Azelia Terzi, who's been incredibly helpful. I don't know where she is, probably keep doing stuff for me after has been so patient. And this is it, but I'm leaving because, as you know, we will continue the conversation and we have people attending the Athens Roundtable in Brussels. Please get drinks and whatever you want now, relax a little bit, and then we go.
Yes, and we didn't have a break, but that's not surprising.